Hi, welcome back to Digital Defense. I'm your host, Jordan Robertson, broadcasting to you live from Washington, D.C., the Bloomberg News Bureau here. This is our weekly cybersecurity webcast, and we take questions from all viewers. So if you're watching on Facebook Live or Periscope, Bloomberg.com or the Bloomberg terminal, please feel free to send some questions in, and we try to get to as many of them as possible. The topic of today's show is internet providers and the data they collect on you. This is a pretty arcane subject, but there are a few topics in privacy and cybersecurity that are more important. So I want to break down some of these ideas for you today and talk about a few new rules that the Trump administration has put in regarding what internet providers can and can't collect about you and what they can and can't sell. And a spoiler alert here, the Trump administration has rolled back a number of regulations preventing your internet provider from selling data about you. So there are a lot more opportunities now for internet providers to sell data about you. So I'm going to walk you through what some of those data types are, and most importantly, what are some tips and tricks for how you can protect yourself from your internet provider tracking basically everything you do. So with that being said, again, want to emphasize that, that this is an interactive show, and any questions you have, please feel free to send them in, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So one of the graphics I wanted to show you here, this is a visual that the New York Times created for some of its coverage of this topic, and I think it's pretty neat. And basically what's happening here is internet providers, we are the person on the bottom here, internet providers, we are awash in data, and that's the point of this graphic. We're awash in data, and we're producing data even when we don't know it. And that's the really insidious part, and the really tricky part to understanding what it means for an internet provider to sell data about you. We tend to think about metadata and the types of things that we'll be talking about today as an email. I know when I'm sending an email. I know when I'm making a phone call. All of the revelations from Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor, a lot of them concern this idea of metadata. And metadata can have a number of different meanings. Again, a lot of us think of it as the discrete action we take online or the discrete action we take with our phone. But like the reason I'm showing you this graphic is because I think this really represents what it's actually like for us operating on a day-to-day basis in this digital world. We're creating data about ourselves all the time, and we may not even know it. And I want to walk you through a couple of ways that that's true. The first way is, anytime you log onto the internet, whether it's through your phone, which is broadcasting all the time, or at home, you're creating a digital trail of what you do. And again, you may not know it. You're simply firing up your computer, unlocking your smartphone, and you're logging onto the internet. You're not even logging on anymore. You're just tapping a button and you're bringing up the internet. That action alone, you've already created a digital trail that reveals a lot about you. And that can include where you are, number one, the IP address from which you've entered the internet. You've logged onto the internet. That's being created before you even know it. Second, what language are you using? Where are you located? What language are you using? And then, even more importantly than that, what type of computer are you using? Are you on a smartphone? If so, what browser are you using? And if so, what version of software is your operating system? What version of the browser are you using? You're creating all of this data before you've even done anything online. And I find this topic to be fascinating, which is why I wanted to talk about it with everybody today. Because again, what the Trump administration has done, it has rolled back rules preventing internet providers from selling that data about you. Now again, a lot of us think about our data as discrete actions we take online. Internet providers, the reason the National Security Agency is so interested in internet providers and telecommunications companies is they get kind of a God's view of what you do online. And the reason that's so valuable is for all the reasons I've just enumerated. Every interaction you make with the internet is cataloged by your internet provider. And on its own, that data serves a very simple function. That data allows your internet provider to connect you to the websites you choose to visit. There's nothing wrong with your internet provider having that information. The problem becomes, and the potential problem becomes, and the reason some activists, some privacy activists are concerned about this is for all the reasons I've just described, your internet provider has so much more data about you than you may realize. And again, it's not just activities or actions you take, fake. It is simply the act of going on the internet reveals a whole lot about you. And the rollback of these rules has concerned a number of privacy advocates and states as well. So I'll get into that in a minute. But some states are taking up the mantle, as my colleague Todd Shields has reported here at Bloomberg, in saying, well, if the federal government isn't going to protect consumers from this type of data sale, states will. And there's some precedent for states leading the charge in this area. And I do have some tips and tricks for everybody about how to protect yourself from these kinds of things. But first, I'm going to get to some questions. Again, we're getting some great questions, so feel free to put them in the comments section. We like to try to rip through as many of them as we can on this show. First question here. If internet providers are collecting our personal data, is that grounds for a lawsuit? No, not really. The action of collection on its own is not necessarily illegal. Again, internet providers perform a critical service. It's a reason they are, in some ways, considered a utility on par with your telephone, your gas, your water, your electric, things like that. Their job is to connect your computer to websites that you choose to visit, or your phone to websites you choose to visit. In the process, they need to transmit all of this data. These are necessary negotiations between your computer and the internet provider. So the very act of creating this data is not necessarily something nefarious. Where things get tricky is, well, what do they do with that data? You know, my expectation when I subscribe to an internet service, such as Comcast or Verizon or whomever, is that they will get me onto the internet reliably and that they will transmit my data faithfully, and that I will go to the places that Comcast agrees to transmit my data packets to. The problem becomes if Comcast says, hey, we've got a lot of valuable information about Jordan Robertson or whomever else, and they try to make money off of that in a different way than what you've paid them for. That's where it starts to get tricky. Like, say they sell the data to advertisers, and advertisers now know a whole lot more about you than they do even from looking at your Facebook profile or even from looking at your Gmail profile. That's where the problem really comes in, and that's where these states and legislatures are starting to get concerned. Next question here is, what are your recommendations for hiding our personal data from the providers? This gets into really the heart of what this show is about, and there are some recommendations I have. Number one, I should point out, it's pretty much impossible for your internet provider to not know something about you. Again, you have to access the internet if you're trying to use it, so there has to be a way in. Your internet provider is that way in. But there are some things you can do once you're on the internet to prevent your provider from capturing all of your data. The simplest way, just the rock bottom simplest way, is to use a VPN. Now, these are paid services. Some are free, but they collect your data and use them for advertising and things like that. So in general, if you're willing to shell out 40, 50 bucks a year, which is not all that much considering what they provide, these VPN services do provide a lot of anonymity. It's not necessarily security, because you are still connecting over the internet. They are encrypted tunnels, but you're still interacting with websites. So your data will be consumed by those sites and collected by those sites. But what it does do is your internet provider will see that you've logged on, it's captured all that data that I've mentioned, and then it will see that you've logged on to a VPN. From that point, your traffic is shielded from your internet provider. So they will still know a lot about you, and they kind of have to. That's reasonable to assume that they need that information to get you online. After that, however, using a VPN, it's the reason people like Edward Snowden recommend them. Again, they are not a foolproof measure against hackers and privacy violations, but if you're concerned about your internet provider selling your data, that's a really easy way to protect yourself. Another recommendation I have is there's a browser extension called HTTPS Everywhere. And what this basically does is, you may have heard a lot about post-Snowden, this idea of encrypt end-to-end. And these are websites like Google, like Facebook, LinkedIn, and others, that whenever you look in your address bar, you'll see HTTPS instead of just HTTP. What that means is they are encrypting the connection from your machine to their website. Now, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, and others, they're collecting all of that data about you, but they're trying to ensure that that connection from you to their service is secured, is encrypted. If you download this browser extension, again, HTTPS Everywhere, what that will do is it will force an encrypted connection wherever possible between you and that website. Now, again, that will offer a level of protection against this kind of monitoring and surveillance, but not a full blanket protection. And I'll get into some reasons why in a minute. But one of those reasons is that to access websites on the internet, you still have to direct yourself to those websites. So even if your channel is encrypted, your internet provider will still see where you're going. It just won't know what you're doing on that site. It's a technical distinction, but an important one. Next question here is, does incognito window really hide what I do online? Good question. I've seen this a lot, and I've used it a lot. Things like incognito, what they do is that they basically hide the activity from your local browser. These are very misleading in many ways. So what happens when you go on incognito is you are preventing your local browser from storing that information, such as history, places you visit, websites you've gone to. For many people, that's enough. Maybe they don't want somebody in their house knowing what they're doing on their computer, or maybe it's a shared computer. In that case, it's actually pretty valuable. But if what you're worried about is internet provider level surveillance and collection, it's not going to do very much for you at all. Again, these are local solutions, and what happens is you're still transmitting information across the internet the same way you would otherwise without incognito mode. So I would say use those services sparingly and understand what exactly you're hiding and what you're not hiding, and you're not hiding actually all that much. Next question here, is a VPN sufficient? Well, as I mentioned before, VPN is really good if you are concerned about this. Now, just know adding a VPN layer does slow down your internet traffic a little bit. So there is a delay. So a lot of people don't use it for that reason unless they're logging into their work computer or things like that. However, if what you're concerned about, and I can't stress this enough, if your concern is your internet provider tracking you, again, they have to provide you this service. But if you're concerned about Comcast or Verizon, and specifically those companies selling your data, you can add a level of obfuscation by going through a VPN. But again, I can't stress this enough either, the sites that you go to, if you use a VPN and then you go log into your Gmail account, Gmail is still going to collect absolutely everything about you. So as with most things online, there are trade-offs and there's no silver bullet. So what I will say is just understanding who's collecting what about you and what they can do with it is really important. And unfortunately, I think a lot of privacy advocates have viewed this as a pretty unfortunate development, that what the Trump administration has done is said that internet providers are free to sell your information, essentially. They're basically being treated differently than normal telecommunications companies. And this is what internet providers wanted. They lobbied very heavily for this. So that's something that's going to be fought at the state level. Next question here. We're getting some really good ones. Please do keep them coming in any of the comment section of wherever you're watching this. Are internet providers tracking what we do in online banking? Well, basically the big theme of this show today is that internet providers know pretty much everything about what you do online, with some exceptions. They know the big stuff. Again, they know when you log online. They know what type of software you're using. They know which website you're going to. But there's a catch. Once you go to a website, if it's HTTPS encrypted, they're not likely to know very much about what you're doing on that site. And the reason is, all they're going to see is that they're taking you to a bunch of different, let's say, Bank of America websites. They're not going to know necessarily what your password is, because that's going to be encrypted. They're not going to know what's in your bank account, because that page is being delivered to you in an encrypted fashion. They will know, however, that you're going to multiple web pages on the Bank of America site, so they know generally what you're doing. Now, but they can't exactly peer into every single transaction, especially if they're encrypted. That being said, though, and I know this from talking to multiple people in the intelligence community and just studying what the Edward Snowden revelations revealed, which is that metadata is kind of a misnomer. I think Edward Snowden prefers to describe it as just transaction data. And that's the basic idea, which is this metadata tells a whole lot about you, even if the people looking at this information, or the computers looking at this information more accurately, don't know the content of your communications. They know that I spent 5 minutes on BofA.com. They know that I spent 5 minutes on Bloomberg.com. You can track people's activities with a very fine degree of precision, knowing just what they're doing online, when and where. So that's the big concern. And again, the internet providers have a much more comprehensive view of your online activities than any single website, no matter how aggressive their tracking is. And that's the really important thing to remember. Next question here. What about chat programs like Slack and HipChat? Are those messages being collected? Another important point to mention is that a lot of times you'll see stories specifically around the Edward Snowden revelations that said things like they're logging all your chat histories, all your emails, all of everything. Pick your favorite application you're using online. That's not technically true in most cases. The reason is this: especially post Edward Snowden, post 2013, companies have moved aggressively to this form of encryption between your computer and theirs, the HTTPS that I mentioned. So when that happens, again, your internet provider has to connect you to that service. It will see every web page that you access because it's delivering those packets to you. However, if those services are encrypted, like Slack and other apps, they're not going to see the contents of your messages unless, of course, there's been a hack or there's some sort of exploit that governments are using. That's a totally different discussion. But on its own, the internet provider will just see that you are sending lots of messages through Slack because it's bringing up all these new web pages and it's processing all of these packets. That's a good thing. I mean, you want the service, but you don't necessarily want persistent surveillance kind of throughout your life. So that's why this push toward end-to-end encryption has been such a big deal post-2013. And I think consumers should take some measure of comfort in that fact. Now again, and I've said this a million times, those services log everything about you. Those services in some ways are just as powerful as the internet providers, but they don't have nearly the breadth of visibility into your online activity. So it's just important to be aware which sites and which services track you and what they're collecting. Another question here is, can they track your location when you use apps like Uber? This is a really important point. Geolocation is handled differently from app to app and internet provider to internet provider. Your internet provider, in providing you that service and providing you that geolocation, they do know where you are. That's a fundamental part of the service that your cellular provider offers you. And again, I'm not making a distinction here between landline and cell phone. So when geolocation is used, you just think about it this way. If the packet has to be delivered to you, and in reverse, the packet has to be delivered to a service that you're using, that's information that has to be handled by someone. And it's not just handled by the app. It's handled by your internet provider, in this case, your mobile phone internet provider. So it's important to remember. Are ISPs allowed to sell this information? Well, now they are. That's the big change that the Trump administration has made, is that these providers are allowed to sell this information. And they've been clamoring for this for years. What they're seeing is internet providers are seeing companies like Google, like Amazon, like Facebook, making huge amounts of money off the personal data they collect. And these internet providers are standing over here saying, well, wait a second, we've got that data too. What's up with us? And the problem is they have been constrained by this regulatory framework, but the way that they're regulated the same way as telcos. And your telephone provider is not allowed to sell data in the same way now as an internet provider is. And it's a big change. It's a wonky kind of esoteric change, but the point of this show is to tell you it has real applications beyond what you might be able to discern when you fire up the internet on your computer. Question here is, what are IT security professionals doing to improve the security of household appliances that are now getting connected to the internet? Well, we saw a big attack, I believe it was last year, the Mirai botnet that used compromised home closed-circuit cameras, baby monitors, things like that, and DVR machines. These are high-bandwidth devices in your home that I believe this viewer is referencing. What we're seeing is, people are starting to understand that those devices do have a high-bandwidth connection to the internet and can be used by hackers and other nefarious actors for malicious purposes. So they're starting to recognize that, but I would say we're far from those devices being fully secured. And the reason is this: a lot of those devices are cheap. They're cheap. They're just consumer off-the-shelf devices. They're made cheaply. They're sold cheaply. They provide a service, but you should really be cautious when you're doing things like hooking up a camera into your home, or even hooking up a DVR from your internet provider. Because those devices are surveillance systems too, and if they're not secured properly, you can have things happen like the Mirai botnet, which knocked out big parts of the internet. And so that's just a really important point to remember, that not all devices are created the same. Question here is, if you're using Tor, which is an anonymity network, are you pretty much safe? The answer is, I'll say mixed. Let's just say this. Like using a VPN, the value of Tor is that you're running your traffic through other nodes on the internet, other computers running Tor. So there is a measure of anonymity that affords you. That is true. However, the way the question is phrased is, are you pretty much safe? I would disagree. I'd push back on that part, because here's the problem. You can shield your information from, some of your information from your internet provider that way. That part is true. However, the problem becomes you are transmitting your traffic through other nodes on the internet, many of which are run by government surveillance intelligence agencies. So that's not a secret. That is well known. So the problem becomes it all depends on who are you trying to shield your information from. Again, if you're going to go through these lengths, you're going to use a VPN, you're going to use Tor, you're going to do all of these crazy things to get yourself more secure and more private for your internet providers, but then you go log into a Gmail and you go log into your Facebook using your actual, your real account information. You got to start to think like, well, what's really the point? You're trading one bad practice, one troubling practice for another. And my whole point in all this is not to unplug from your internet provider, use a VPN all the time, because we do give up data as part of our daily lives online. That's just an important part of that transaction. The point of this show is to be aware that when you see headlines like ones that we've seen over this past week and past couple of months about what the federal government is doing to roll back some of these regulations on internet providers, I think it's really important for my viewers to know exactly what they're talking about. It's not just esoteric data about your comings and goings online. It's really specific information about who you are and what you do. So as states start to adopt and start to legislate and debate stricter regulations than the federal government has, again, like my colleague Todd Shields reported today in Bloomberg, it's really important, I think, to be aware of what that actually means. And again, it's not just some anti-privacy thing. These are really serious discussions around your day-to-day online activities. Last question here is, so who would buy the data and what would they sell you? Another good question. The buyers for this data could be anybody. I mean, primarily it's advertisers. You think about who has a monetary incentive to actually buy this information. It's almost always going to be advertisers, but the potential buyers could really be anybody. You think about some of these large data brokers. Once you open these floodgates, the problem becomes, once you actually sell this information, you're not just limiting it to advertisers. And I'll give you an example. The way Google and Facebook use your information is not by blanket selling it. That data is far too valuable. So Google and data don't just offer your data for sale. They offer a service for sale which targets ads to you based on that data. It's a really important distinction. And the reason it's important is Google and Facebook, again, are not just giving away your data. They're giving away inferences based on it. And but what internet providers can do, and again, this is kind of uncharted territory, if they're just allowed to sell your data, again, not selling a service related to it, you could think of a million different entities that would be interested in it. Governments obviously would be interested in it. Data brokers that already have lots of information about you from public records could then combine it with this private information. There are a whole host of reasons to be concerned about it. And the reason that this is becoming such a big deal here in Washington and throughout states is that there needs to be regulations around it. Again, your telephone company cannot just sell your information to whoever they want. They're subject to the normal U.S. court orders. There are some types of data they are able to sell or monetize through ads. But what you want is some tightly worded regulations around these things, because this is the most intimate personal data you have online, and you don't just want anyone to have access to it. Well, with that, we've about run out of time here. I really want to thank everybody for writing in with your questions. We always get good questions on the show, and we really appreciate it. It's a show we put a lot of effort into, and we're glad that you're enjoying it and getting something out of it. As always, please feel free to write me offline. I'm on Twitter at JordanR1000. That's the letter JORDAN, the letter R1000. Or you can tweet to us at Technology. That's the Bloomberg Technology Twitter account. And please do go to our website, which is bloomberg.com/technology. And there you'll find a couple of things I hope you'll find of interest, one of which is a similar show by my colleague Mark Gurman called Gadgets with Gurman, and also a podcast called Decrypted, which we have a new episode up as of yesterday on a hostage situation in Mauritania involving a cyber weapons deal gone bad. So please do go check those out. Again, thanks as always for watching this week's episode of Digital Defense, and we'll see you next week.